Hi everyone, it's time for my monthly sewing chat, and today's topic is a big one because I am talking about hemming. And when I began doing the show notes for this episode, I realized that this is a topic that I could probably do like 3 episodes, so we will see how far I will come during this 1 hour live stream. But if we discover even more topics, I'm definitely open to do a part 2 of this series. So I also want to devote quite a bit of time to talk about hemming struggles, and that we can perhaps bring our brains together and try to figure out the best ways to solve some of those common hemming problems that we all have, including myself for sure. I named this live chat How to Hem Like a Pro, but that's more aspirational than the actual situation for me. So I'm so nice to see some people in the chat. Hi Kyle, hi Duncan, hi Kathleen. Please say hi in the chat and I will keep up with the chat and do my best to answer questions during the live stream. And of course, feel free to keep the discussion going in the chat and help each other out, because I'm sure this is a topic that will raise a lot of questions. So that is the topic of tonight: how to hem like a pro, or at least try to hem like a pro. And if you stay to the end, I will also do a bit of an announcement, because I'm a little bit nervous even to talk about this, but I've been working hard on a project lately that I've only shared so far with my patrons, but I will give you a bit of a sneak peek for that at the end of the live show. It's not a huge thing, but it's still something that I feel ready to announce now, at least, that it's in the works. So stay tuned for that in the end. Hi Pauline, hi Dallas, hi Libby from Northern California, Therese from Hisingen, that's just in the city where I live, it's in the big island. And we have Nicey and Lise from Denmark. Well, we have quite an international crowd as always, so nice. And New Jersey is represented by Kyle. Hi Kyle, hope I haven't forgotten anyone. Dallas says hemming jersey, hemming knit is definitely a topic that I will cover in tonight's live stream, because that is something that I think we have all struggled with from time to time, because I would venture out to say that stretchy fabrics can be one of the biggest hemming struggles, I think, especially if you only have access to a regular sewing machine. So that's definitely something I want to devote time to tonight. And we have more people from Sweden here: Karina, Susanne, and Angela from Hamburg in Germany. So there's a lot of people in the chat already. So now let's start with what I'm going to talk. So basically the plan for this live stream is to go through different hemming techniques and different materials, and also of course discuss what type of problems that we encounter when we're hemming. So please feel free to ask questions during the stream here if you come up with something, and I will try to answer that meanwhile. But I also have a big list of common problems, some of those that I would love to also get help with myself, that I want to address. So more about that in a minute. But now I'm going to start with part 1, and I'm actually going to start with a hemming technique that is one that I use a lot, and I'm sure you do too. And I think it's a really important technique to learn if you are, or sort of nail if you are making your own clothes, and that is blind hemming, and in particular blind hemming on the sewing machine, and the various techniques that we can employ to do that. And of course also chat a bit about hand blind hem stitching, which is how I started out doing blind hems, but I don't do it as much anymore, because I've become quite proficient at doing it just using a regular sewing machine. So I'm going to start now with talking about various methods to achieve a nice looking blind hem stitch, especially on the sewing machine. Hi Myra, and hi Cecilia as well, and Liz. All right, so let's start with that now. Yes, the method I employ the most when it comes to blind hemming is the blind hem stitch foot on the regular sewing machine. I would love to know if you're a fan of this as well. I do it so much. And the trick that I have there are basically 2 things that it's important to know. And the first one is, of course, that you need to nail the stitch length of the triangle so that it just catches a tiny bit of thread. So that's I think is the biggest struggle for me, at least when it comes to blind hemming, that it's so easy that it either catches too much fabric or too little, so it basically doesn't catch the fabric at all, you know, the triangle stitch. And so that is one of the biggest things. So you need to, I usually like to do some sample testing before I start stitching the real thing, because I find it really easy to miss several stitches if I'm not too careful. So it's also really important, I think, to control the fabric so that it really lies tight to the blade, as you can see here. So you definitely need to make sure that the blade aligns with the folded edge of the fabric. And as for the overcasting, I'm not sure if everyone does this, but this is my best technique when it comes to this, and that is to cover the to overcast the hem using if you have a serger, you should definitely use that, because if you use the 3-thread overlock stitch, that's the most common. I also sometimes use the flat lock stitch, but I'm sort of switching now more to the 3-thread overlock stitch. And the good thing about that is that it actually hides the stitching, the sort of uneven stitching on the blind hem. So that's one of the great thing about using this method. And secondly, if you are working on fabrics that perhaps the hem is sort of A-line, so you have excess fabric, if you mixture a little bit with the differential feed of the edge of the fabric, you can actually squeeze and pull together the edge of the fabric. So that means it balances out, and that makes the hem more even when you fold it up, if you understand what I mean. I hope I explained this well. So this is definitely one of my favorite methods, and I would love to know if you have any tips to really excel with a blind hem stitch, or if you have any struggles with this as well, because I'm sure some people are not as big fans, because obviously if you use hand stitching you have way more control, but at least I find it less durable, at least with my skill level. And I use blind hemming pretty much all the time. So here you can see this is a kilt. It's actually done of proper Scottish tartan wool, and here you can see the inside. It's overcast with the overlock stitch, and then inside here, just a little bit from the edge, is I've stitched with the blind hem stitch. So you can see on fabrics like this, you won't see pretty much any visible dots from the needle thread. At least I think I can do a pretty good job with that. But of course, again, sometimes I miss the a stitch here and there. I mean, I'm not too obsessed. You can actually go over it doing it again. We have several fans of this method, actually. Myra and Kyle and Kathleen said they all love these techniques, but Angela says, I blind stitched until now only by hand because I'm afraid to ruin the whole thing. Yes, I can understand that. And when you're working with very thin fabrics, it's probably better to use the hand stitching. But if you're using like wool in this case, and twill fabrics, gabardine, any type of fabric that has some side sort of weave that is a bit thicker, so you can actually catch the inside, I think it's definitely no problem. You won't ruin anything. Plus the good thing is that because you can the stitches are spaced out, so you have more it's actually less cumbersome to rip, because you usually only need to remove the stitch we had to catch the fabric. So in a way, there's actually less risk of ruining this than using a lot of other techniques. And Nice says, London, your nail polish. Yes, I did try to sort of give myself a bit of a glam makeover tonight. I'm sitting here basically in my pajamas, but at least I have some new nail polish on, so thank you. But that I'm going to show you a really cool trick when it comes to blind hemming, because I'm not sure that everyone is aware of this, and I've done lots of tutorials both on YouTube and on my blog about this technique. But it is that you can actually use this blind hem stitch technique on a lot of knit fabric. So that, I think, is a pretty great thing to know, because as we will probably talk a lot more about soon, is that, you know, hemming knits is can be quite a challenging experience, especially if you only have your sewing machine. So I'm going to show you now my favorite way of blind hemming and knit fabrics. I'm going to give you some real life examples as well. So basically you do the same thing as I showed you on woven fabrics. You start by overcasting the edge with the serger, and the great thing again is because knit fabrics will stretch out. By using this method you will actually be able to keep the fabric in check, especially if you increase the differential feed, and you just stitch just like you would regularly. Of course it helps if your thread matches the fabric. It's much more difficult with printed fabric. I'm going to show you a real life example in just a minute here, but it's a really great method. And I challenge you on this particular, it's a Ponte di Roma or a double knit, because that's basically one of those fabrics that are really suitable for hemming. I challenge you to find any visible thread on the outside, but this is actually blind hem. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with this method, but if you haven't tried it, I definitely recommend that you do it, especially if you are working with sweater knits, sweatshirt fabrics, and thicker double knits like Ponte di Roma. All these fabrics are excellent for this blind hem. So I'm curious if you employ this method. I found it initially in the book, the Sewing Knits book by Connie Long. It's a great book. I've talked about it in several chats before. I highly recommend you get one. And then I sort of refined it by adding the overcasted edge from the serger just to make the inside looks really neat. And so I'm going to show you now a real life example where I employed this method when it was a struggle. So about, let me see, it was 1.5 years ago I did a wrap dress, and then I encountered the challenge of hemming it, because I didn't want to use my cover stitch machine, because I wanted to look a bit more, neat than having 2 rows of stitches. So this is how it looks like. Now of course you can see this is very much a printed fabric, and I use black thread. So if you look up close, I'm sure you can probably see some of the dots. Let me see here. It actually looks less visible, but yeah, there you can see one, for instance, there. But overall, I would say there are a couple of dots again. But overall, I was able to do this with a pretty good result, I think. So, and this is obviously the inside, as you can see. You recognize the overlock stitch, and then of course I stitched overused the blind hem, and very, very elastic. And actually Connie Long has a recommendation as well, and that is to, if your fabric is even more stretchy, to actually use a zigzag stitch instead of the blind hem stitch. But I have not found that necessary, but it's definitely worth trying if your fabric is even more stretchy, I would assume. So have you tried this one? And if you haven't, definitely do. And Libby says about the blind hem, I like the machine blind hem for more texture fabric. The overlock also gives a good guide for the fold and keeps it more even. That's a great point, absolutely. You will be, because that's also one of the tricky things when you're doing a blind hem stitch, is that it's really hard because you can't use your traditional measuring tool. It's really hard to make sure that each stitch has the same distance from the edge. So that definitely helps. Good point, Libby. And Libby says, do you ever use invisible thread for hemming prints? I was actually, when I did this wrap dress, several people told me in the chat, because I've done a video about that you can check out. It's called How to Sew a Wrap Dress inspired by the Diane for Furstenberg's dresses. And there were several people actually recommending me that I try to use invisible thread. The answer is I haven't, but I think in this case it would have been a good idea. And next time I do something similar, I will probably use that instead. So are any one of you have tried using the invisible thread for blind hemming? I would love to know, because I do have invisible thread, but obviously the hand of invisible thread is a bit different because it's made out of nylon, so it's how should I say, it's a bit springy, right? It's not as soft and supple as regular sewing thread, so I'm not 100% sure how it works when you're doing a blind hem stitch, but I would assume that it works because there was several people who recommended that I have used that instead, so it's definitely perhaps worth trying out. But there are actually 2 more ways to achieve blind hem stitching, and now we're going to talk about the method that I have tried a couple of times on my old Serger but have not become friends with, and that is doing blind hem stitching on your Serger. And sometimes, at least if you buy the baby lock Sergers, at least when I bought mine, this hem presser foot was included. Otherwise you can usually buy it as a standalone. It's quite expensive, at least I paid quite a lot for my old machine, my Fuff. And what it does is basically that it stitch a blind hem using the flat lock seam. And it's a great stitch when you're sewing knits. And if you look, perhaps if you go say at a vintage store and check out t-shirts and stuff from the 70s, you can often find this hemming method on t-shirts. But, and this is a but for me at least, but I'm not sure it's for everybody else, this is how it can look on the outside. And if you're using matching thread, obviously this is not very visible, and it can actually be a cool effect. As I said, it's quite a common method on vintage knit garments, especially t-shirts. But and I'm sure with practice and, you know, setting the presser foot right, I'm pretty sure you can achieve a better result. To be honest, I never gave it enough time, and I was considering using it for the wrap dress, but I realized that it would be too big of a learning curve on such a precious project to do it. I will definitely train more in the future, and I would love to know if you have achieved better result, i.e. being able to make those ladder stitches a bit smaller or perhaps more discreet. Or again, I can see that this is probably a great technique if you're using some kind of spongy sweater fabric. And of course black on black, that won't be visible, but if you're doing printed fabrics, I would feel that those stitches will be a bit obvious. I would love to hear your thoughts about that. And Myra has some thoughts about the visible thread. She says, yes, it's too stiff for some fabrics. Good to know, Myra. I feel that. And Angela says, if I have a YouTube video on blind stitch hemming, I have one tutorial on the how to do it on knit fabrics. It's a little bit older. Sometimes I feel a bit hesitant recommending some older videos because obviously technically I've become more skilled over time, but I can also see myself doing a tutorial on how to do regular blind hem stitching on the sewing machine. Just that I feel perhaps there are like a million great tutorials about that already. I'm not sure, but I can imagine that this is quite well served already. But if you're curious about the blind hem, that you can find in my older video. I have a tutorial for that, and it's also on my blog. And then we have the last method of blind hemming, and that actually requires one to get a special machine because it's the industrial blind hem technique. And if you buy garments ready to wear, both I would say trousers and knit fabrics, this is a very common method, and it looks like it was done on a serger. You can see this. So this is how it looks on the outside. Very, very discreet, right? Still, it's a printed fabric. The thread is navy blue, but at least I can't see any blue dots on the white surface, and it looks like that on this. So it's again quite similar to the method that I talked about when you combine the overlock with the blind hem stitch, but this is a special machine, and I have no idea if it's available for the domestic market. I would assume it's not, but that is definitely next level, and the result is absolutely gorgeous. I mean, if I look close up, I can't see anything. So if you're curious on how they do it in the garment industry, they use a special machine for that, so it's not really accessible for us, unfortunately. So then I would say that the second best thing is to combine the machine blind hem stitch with the serged edge, I think, at least. So that was all about the blind hemming stitch. And let me see here if I have some questions in the chat. Libby says, the blind hem on the serger seems like too much thread, too many unnecessary stitches when the regular machine blind hem makes plenty of bites in the fabric. That is if you don't want to. I very much agree with that, Libby. I think they're very closely set apart as well. I'm sure you can tamper with the stitch length, but again, it's just too much thread. I would agree. And Martha says, I've tried blind stitching on the serger, but I never really found it too successful. Even have the proper foot, and there's usually a bit of a ridge. Yeah, I know the ridge as well. Sometimes you can get rid of it a little bit with pressing, but I too struggle with that when I was trying to learn this technique, which I tried and then I gave up. So to be honest, I think the last time I tried was like 9 years ago. I still have the presser foot, but I don't have the machine. And well, maybe I'll try the baby lock as well. And Angela says something very kind here. There might be millions of tutorials, but I love the way you're explaining things. Thank you so much, Angela. That's very encouraging to hear. So yeah, there's definitely not a total winner, I would say, the Serger blind hem. So because I was actually I bought the presser foot naively. Obviously it was like 10 years ago, so it wasn't as much resources out there as there is today, which probably also was a cause that I made a misinformed decision. But it's not as good as one might think, and I'm definitely think that that is one of the sort of presser foot investment that might be not very it will be very high cost for a very little use. So it's definitely not presser foot that I would put on my priority list when it comes to buying presser for the sergers. For instance, I use the elastic presser foot for sergers a lot because that's really useful. But the blind hem, as I said, well, I tried it a couple of times and then didn't touch it again. Oh, Myra says also, I agree with Angela. Johanna's very good at explaining and sharing. Thank you so much, Myra. That means a lot to her, and I would definitely consider in the future. Well, that was hemming technique number 1, and now I'm going to show you my favorite techniques when it comes to hemming blouses, doing a narrow hem, because that is one of the struggles that I have personally, and that is to stitch straight. That seems to be a lifelong struggle for me. Perhaps it's different for other people, but that's how it is for me. I can't cut straight either, so it's probably something genetic. Anyways, this is how I do a narrow hem, and when you're doing a narrow hem, the struggle is obviously to make sure that that it's even, that it looks absolutely even, because you want it to look as pretty on the inside as the outside. So my best tips is actually to stitch. This is a classic technique that I am a big fan of and I use all the time, especially on lightweight fabric like silk, cotton voile. And that is that you start by stitching a straight stitch using the edge of the presser foot or the inbuilt seam ruler. So this is your fold guide. So this is not this stitch where you stitch on a single layer, and this white line is where you will fold and press. And this makes such an even. So you just fold it up like this. I don't overcast because I don't really like bulk, but if you don't want to use the straight stitch, or if you perhaps are using if you want to do even a more narrow hem, or I would definitely recommend that you also use if you have a serger, to overcast the edge, either using the narrow 3-thread overlock or the wide one, and then you can obviously use that stitch, which is I think a narrow is about 3mm perhaps, and the wide is 6mm. So you can actually use that as well as a folding guide, and then you just fold in at the stitch line, then you fold again so that the stitch line on top, and then you just top stitch it like you regularly would. And I find that this works really well for someone as me who's perhaps isn't gifted when it comes to the finer works of sewing. So this is how it looks on the inside. Now obviously I could have stitched even closer to the edge, for this is on the inside of the fabric. I could definitely stitch even closer to the edge. That's one of my struggles still, but as you can see, it looks really neat on the inside, and that is just due to the fold, and you can't even see the stitch because it's basically hidden inside of the fold right there. So this is one of my favorite methods, and I would love to know what your favorite method is for stitching lightweight fabrics. And this is really good also when you're using I should say like really lightweight fabrics. This is also good because it also gives you a bit of control, and especially if you're working with, say, flowy silk fabrics, they are actually quite difficult to hem because they're so unstable. So if this little stitch, or perhaps even better sometimes to use an overcast edge with overlock stitch, just makes the folding process so much easier. Of course, pressing helps a lot too. And Myra says, roll hem is my real struggle. Mine too, and I'm going to address that in just a minute, the sort of the really narrow roll hem. That is one of my struggles as well. And Claire says, what width do you stitch the first line? It depends on what type of hemming I'm doing, but on a regular, say, blouse, I usually stitch that 1 centimeter, which equals to, let me see it, to 5 inches, I think. So that's about it, and half a centimeter if I'm doing a narrow hem. And Libby says this method works great even on chiffon, and that is a great thing because that is one of the most trickiest fabrics. I'm going to show you some samples of that later on as well. And Duncan used the overlock method. He says finish the edge when overlock and then turn and stitch. And Kyle says, have you tried the narrow hem foot for your sewing machine? I was able to get the hang of mine, except that there are joints in the fabric. Well, you are much better than I am, Kyle, because I tried and gave up on that presser foot. So I'm going to show you that now, because several people talked about it. On some sewing machines, the rolled presser foot comes with, let's see if I can put it up here. It's always the technical stuff, right? This is what Kyle refers to. This is sometimes included in when you buy a sewing machine, or you can get it separately. So it basically folds and stitches at the same time, and I would say this is a very practice intense little tool. A lot of people, including myself, have struggled with it. Back in the 80s and early 90s, I was a big fan of buying a lot of vintage beautiful dresses, and since they're quite short, I had to hem them, and several times I tried to use the roll hem presser foot, but I usually ended up with very twisted hems, and so I stretched out because I wasn't capable of manipulating the fabric properly. So I ended up stretching out the fabric, especially it's usually cut slightly on the bias, right? So it stretches out. So I'm really curious, Kyle, if you have any tips on how you were successful with using the sewing machine roll hem, because that struggle is real, I would say, for a lot of people. And Heather says, my finger seems to get in the way of the rolling hem stitch. I can seem to see straight, perhaps go a bit slower. Yeah, I would love to hear the best practices on how to do a roll hem. So what I do instead is that I use my serger for the roll hem, and obviously this is not the same thing, because you will have, as you can see here, you will have a visible thread, but it's absolutely so how shall I say, it's very, very lightweight and doesn't hinder the drape of the fabric whatsoever. And this roll hem was actually done on my not very good serger that I replaced and bought a baby lock a couple of years ago. But it's still, as you can see, it's really nice even on a bad serger. So this is definitely my preferred method when it comes to doing roll hem. If you are struggling with the machine hem version of that, sewing machine version, which I'm sure I'm not alone with. And Kyle gives us the inside scoop of her attempts here. One day I spent 90 minutes just practicing the narrow hem to get the hang of it, but I never got a hang of it. Where there are seams, yes, I wonder how they do that in the industrial setting, because obviously those seams, they add a lot of bulk, and I'm sure that, you know, it will get sort of it won't sort of properly align, right? And it yeah, that's a good point. I remember that struggle from my struggles as well. And Duncan says, I failed with those narrow hemming feet. Well, another one. But now I use the roll hem on the Imagine. Well, same here, same here. So bad news for you. Perhaps you don't have a serger. So I'm sure that if one put even more practice into it, but as Kyle says, you know, how do you go over the seams? Well, that's a tricky nut to crack. So yeah, definitely something to think about. But there's actually one other way to do roll hem. And Angela has some inside info here on the roll hem situation. She says, I do the joints later when the rest is done. Well, that means do you close the so you stitch each piece and then you close it, or am I? It's always hard when you can't show, and my brain sometimes has a hard time visualizing this. But or do you sort of leave it and then stitch together and then sort of fold it in and stitch over afterwards, if that makes sense? I would love to get that. You stopped before. Okay, yes, I understand. Because that's a good idea, because then you will be able to fold it in and stitch over. I can see that. That makes sense. Maybe I should give it another try. But you know, as when you have a roll hem on the Serger, it's easy to not doing that. But there, speaking of chiffon, which came up in the chat just before here, you can actually do a hand roll hem as well, and that is not something I do a lot, but when I got married, I actually took the time to do that. This is my wedding dress, and the sleeves are made of silk chiffon. And here I did a hand roll hem, and since the fabric is so sheer, it was definitely a very intense experience trying to make sure that the roll hem was even. If I was perhaps more skilled, I would have been able to make the hem even more narrow, but that was not my forte. But as you can see, I'm pretty happy with the result. I don't think it's too bad for the first attempt, but that was definitely another avenue to explore. And I like hand sewing, even though I'm not very good at it, but when you don't do it often, it can actually be quite relaxing. It's nice to step away from the sewing machine and, you know, perhaps watch a movie, sit on the sofa. So hand sewing can be quite a nice change of pace when it comes to sewing. And we have Sherry now. Georgina Mara says, that's beautiful, you did a great job. Thank you so much, Myra. It was actually, I love doing tricky projects if I don't have to do them too often. But that was obviously a special occasion for that dress, and I love how it turned out. I was very inspired by the 50s type of dresses, you know, which has like a heart-shaped bodice in silk, rayon velvet, and then the silk sheer things going on. Let me see here. And now we're going to talk about one of the topics that I talked about in the beginning, namely hemming knits. And I'm going to run through several techniques now that one can employ for hemming knits, and also discuss the pros and cons about those, and when to use each at the same time. And Sherry's making a herb garden. Oh, that sounds lovely. Especially, I'm very jealous. I live in an apartment with, I don't even have a balcony, so it's something I would love to have someday, some type of garden. So let's talk about knits. And the basic struggle of knits is that so when you're working with knits, you definitely need to use some type of hemming techniques that have some built-in stretch for the most part. I mean, obviously most knits will have some substantial amount of stretch. If you have a regular sewing machine, the twin needle is probably one of the most employed options, especially if you're doing like more stretchy knits such as those with spandex or lycra, as I've now learned to say. In Sweden we say lycra, but I know now that we say lycra in English, so I have now learned that. And anyways, and these works quite well. It can be a struggle, I find, to get the tension, the bobbin tension, or the tension on the back side right. As you can see here, it sort of, it creates a zigzag stitch, but it's not always it's kind of hard to get the balance right and to avoid that the tunnel is formed. So I would love to hear your best tips on how to avoid that when stitching with the twin needle. I sometimes actually use some type of water soluble stabilizer to keep that, because I find that that prevents the tunnel to form. So when you wash that away, there will actually perhaps become a little bit of a tunnel, but it's less prominent than if I hadn't used the stabilizer at all. Of course, experimenting with the tension is definitely helpful, but it can be a little bit tricky if you're experimenting too much with the bobbin tension, because obviously that will mess up the settings for your regular stitching. So if you have a separate bobbin, that is a great idea if you're doing a lot of twin needle stitching. So that can definitely be a tricky thing. And Sherry says, I had a heck of a time hemming running pants for my ex-wife. I want to do a good job and I wasn't having a needed cover stitch machine. Well, when you're involved, especially if you're doing like activewear and things, it really does help having a cover stitch machine. That's just the truth. So especially if you want to make the result look professional. And of course, another perhaps underutilized stitch for the on the sewing machine is the three-step straight stitch, and it goes basically back and forth. I think most sewing machines will have this stitch, and this is works really well if you're stitching stable knits such as sweatshirt knits like this. It's actually provide a really nice finish that looks almost like a straight stitch until you look up close. There you can see that there's actually a stitch going back and forth, and the fact that the stitch goes back and forth like this makes it much more stretchy than a regular straight stitch, which you obviously want to avoid when you're stitching knits, because it usually will result in a lot of pop stitches. So trust me, I have tried that many times, and the end result is always the same, especially if you have knits with some stretch in it. The drawback of that stitch is that it's absolutely terrible to rip. So you definitely need to make sure that you know what you're doing when you start using that stitch, but it's definitely something I can recommend on your regular sewing machine as well. And Libby says, twin needle hemming was one of my most dreaded tasks. It makes me even happy to have a cover stitch machine knowing I never have to use a twin needle again. Yeah, and that's sometimes you can do a lot with a sewing machine, and I don't want to discourage anyone, because just like everything else, a lot of it comes down to practice, and you can just, by manipulating the fabric, experiment with different settings like the stitch length, tension, all these things. And as I said, you employ some type of stabilizer, you will be able to achieve pretty good result on the sewing machine. And as I showed you with the blind hemming stitch, you can actually achieve a really good looking finish using your sewing machine. But again, it isn't, a cover stitch machine will just do a better job when it comes to those stretchy spandex type of fabrics. It just does, and well, but you don't need to have it. It's just that if you're struggling a lot, yeah, it does help. That's just how it is. And Sherry says, I have twin needles for pin tucks. Yeah, and that's great for that, obviously, and that works really well. So with the pin tucks, you want that tunneling effect. Obviously, it does a really great job for that. So that's a beautiful way to use the twin needle as well. You can also use it for decorative stitches. So as I mentioned here about the cover stitch, which I seem to talk incessantly about, and I'm also doing a book about it. The cover stitch is obviously has all the benefits of the twin needle and so much more. And the best thing about the cover stitch is two things. Basically, you have the differential feed, so you can keep the fabric in check and avoid getting that stretch out effect. And secondly, as you can see here, the loops that are formed on the reverse side makes this fabric incredibly stretchy. I mean, it's insane. You can stretch it out like from one wall to another. Now I'm exaggerating, but if you haven't done anything wrong with the tension or anything, and you have the right stitch lengths, you can. It's very uncommon for a cover stitch seam to pop even under a lot of stress. It can happen, but it's so much more unusual than if you are using a regular sewing machine stitch. It can happen, but as I said, if you're done right, it shouldn't happen. And Martha brings up the great point, the general, and that pertains to hemming as well, and that is practice is the word, always before working on your project. And that's so important. I think a lot of the time we get so impatient and we just want to finish our make, and sometimes we pay for that later, because if we had taken the time to sort of practice the proper stitch length, and also I think it's so easy to think when you buy a presser foot, I've done this mistake many times, it's so easy to think that a new presser foot will solve all your sewing problems for that particular issue. But with almost any presser foot, there comes a learning curve, and if we are not ready to invest all that time into learning this new tool, then perhaps it might not be such a great idea to buy that particular tool. So you definitely need to be prepared to give it time to actually make it work, and perhaps even so it can still be a struggle. So a lot of presser foot, they will in theory simplifies things, but in the short term they will probably make things more complicated. So I definitely only use mostly my regular presser foot and my blind hem, which also works as in edge presser foot. Those are probably the ones I use the most, and the zipper presser foot as well. So a lot of those extra presser foot, they have underwhelmed me, to be honest. And I kind of second that as well. I totally agree. I always test on scraps first. And Sherry Knuss says, how do you hem in your blazer jacket you made? Did you line the inside? Yes, it's lined on the inside and it's hemmed using the blind. Oh yes, Sherry, you weren't in the beginning here. So I used the blind machine, the regular sewing machine blind hem stitch, which I talked about in the beginning of this video. And it's perfect for any type of wool tweed fabric, because the sort of fluffy surface really hides any type of stitch that would otherwise shown on the outside. So plus it's so durable to use that stitch. I mean, it never really lets me down. And Martha says, takes time to save time. Very true. So you really have to prepare to invest that initial time to get amply rewarded in the end. So that's definitely something to be mindful. And I still struggle with that sometimes. I think by now I should know better, but it's so easy to forget. Speaking of hemming knits, which is obviously something we can probably devote a separate stream just about that. But here's a technique, and this is obviously not something I've sewn myself. This is from the Khalid underwear brand. But if you are really struggling, and especially with red knits that doesn't have some type of spandex in it, they will grow like crazy. But if you can live with the look, this is definitely an option to use a rolled hem. Either you can use on your regular sewing machine, you can actually do a scallop hem as well, in which you do like a zigzag stitch that pulls in, or you can of course use your Serger roll hem. And if you want to sort of accentuate this Weber look, I would definitely lower the differential feed and see what that happens, because I would assume that this will stretch out this even more. And this is obviously also a great idea if you want to get that flowy effect on, say, like batwing sleeves and things like that. So that's another option to explore if things are a struggle when it comes to hemming knits. And Kirsten has some suggestions now for the roll hem foot. For using the narrow hem foot, sew first 1 inch seam. While sewing, gather it slightly with the finger behind the presser foot. Great idea, because that's definitely one of my struggles, that I was unable to control the fabric, so I ended up with a wavy roll hem, which is not really pretty, unless that's the look you're going for, which is shown in the last example. And because then it's easy to feed the fabric into the foot. Use previous stitch as a guide while feeding the fabric into the foot. Now I'm almost curious. Thank you, Kirsten. Now I'm almost curious to try this method again. Thing is now that my trusty Bernina in the back here actually didn't come with a roll hem presser foot. And speaking of what I'm prepared to invest in, I was a bit hesitant, since I tried it both on my mother's old Singer and the Husqvarna Viking that I had before. They both had this presser foot, and I was unsuccessful. And we have a few people who loves to trying out things here. Duncan says, some evenings I don't make anything, I just play with what the feet will do. That seems like a really nice way of doing deliberate practice and improving your skills. And Angela says, me too, Duncan. So that seems great. Let me see here. Now I want to talk a bit, I want to just address a couple of sewing struggles, and then I'm going to show you my project that I'm working on. One of my sewing struggles that I think I'm sort of have found a solution to, but it's definitely something that I think I can improve on even more. And I'm a big believer in finger feeding, or sort of keeping the fabric in check by using the finger pressing method. So when I stitch to keep the fabric from growing and to make it shrink, I press the fabric behind the presser foot. And this is a super good method if you're hemming A-line skirt or A-line dresses, anything A-line. You will notice that it can be quite difficult to hem in a nice manner, because obviously if the hem goes like this, you will end up with the excess fabric. And one solution is, which I like to do, is to taper the seam allowance. So if you imagine that the pattern piece will go like this, right? That will remove some of the fold, but obviously since those wide A-line hems often cut slightly on the round as well, you will have that bias effect as well. So it's really hard to control, I find, when you're doing round hems, to control that excess fabric when you're trying to stitch. So those things combined, I'm going to show you how it looks for me. So on the skirt I did here, I used that finger pressing method, and so I'm not sure if you can tell, but there is some gathers on the inside right now. I think it looks fine on the outside, but the excess fabric I had to use the finger press method to keep in. Now, if you're hand stitching your hem, I find it's much easier to control because you work so much with the flow of the fabric. But when you are stitching like that, I'd find it a big struggle. I would love to hear your tips for how to keep that fabric in check. And I'm going to show you another example of this as well. It can be a trouble when you're cover stitching as well. So for instance, here is a raglan top that I did just recently. So this has like, it's a classic baseball tee, so it has a round hem like this. And I think it looks quite fine. And what I do is that I push in the fabric, either using my fingers or an awl. But obviously on the inside, I find it hard to create a really neat stitch. So there will be some, I can't see, you probably not see much, but there is a little bit of a gathering effect. I'm not sure, it looks way more prominent in real life, but it's definitely, to me, hard to make that sort of really neat. And you can also, if you spot, there's very subtle drag lines, which is also one of the struggles when you're hemming on the round, I think. Getting rid of that excess fabric and also making sure that the fabric lies flat. So that's one of my hemming struggles. Libby says, if you can press your hem up accurately, you can sew from the top side, and the feed dogs help a lot to feed in the extra fabric from the hem allowance. Oh, that's good. Because that's definitely one of the things, to keep that in check and evenly distributed, because I can keep it in check, but then sometimes I find that I have this little fold happening just while I'm stitching, and it just drives me nuts. I mean, I'm definitely one of those people that are a little bit obsessed about how it looks from the inside as well. And Kyle says, for hemming A-line skirts and dresses, I like to crank up the differential feed on my serger and sew the raw edge first, which gathers up, then fold and press, then blind hem on my sewing machine and press. That's a great idea, and that's also what I did on the I had to do both things on the skirt I just showed you there. And Duncan says you can starch to add stability. I do that sometimes when I'm hemming knits, and I'm pretty sure it will work. I know people love to do it when they're stitching on like chiffon, because I had several chiffon nightmares. So next time I'm definitely doing starch. So I definitely think it would help. And Adela says I also reduce the top tension on my sewing machine. And Kyle says also, I always test first to see how much I need to crank up the differential feed, because yeah, that's good to find that perfect balance, because obviously you will end up cranking it too much as well, and that can be too much gas. You can usually return a little bit, but it's tricky for sure. And Kate had a question here in the chat. Let me see here. Ignore this if you already addressed this question, but I'm late. But how do you get rid of the tunnel between the rows on a 3-thread cover stitch? That's a big topic, but it's usually getting the tension balance right between the looper threads and the tension. So you definitely need to experiment with that, and also increasing the stitch length can help. But most of all, it comes also, and thirdly, to make sure that all 3 threads captures the fabric. So sometimes one stitch will end up outside, and that can also create that ridge. So you definitely need to experiment a bit with that. And David says, which do you think is best for hem, serger, or sewing machine? Sewing machine, hands down, but a serger will definitely help you control the fabric and gives a much nicer finish on the inside. But you can't really hem much with the serger, as we talked about previously. And also Liz says, how about using wash away stabilizer when sewing those curves on knits with the cover stitch? That adds weight and stability and wash away. Yeah, absolutely. I've tried that, and that definitely works. Sometimes I'm just too lazy to do all that, but it can definitely help. And Sherry says, Kate, yes, and also, of course, as Sherry says as well, regarding the cover stitch, using a stabilizer, that will help as well, because even though when you wash it away, it can create a slight ridge or tunnel, but it will be much less visible. Yes, well, that was this is such a big topic. I have more things, but I figure why not make a part two of this hemming, because I haven't even got to things like hemming jeans and lots of other stuff. But now I want to show you a little project I've been working on for the last I should say weeks more intensely, but it has been on my mind for a lot longer, and that is that I am I feel even nervous talking about it like this, but I'm actually done a small sewing pattern line. And before you imagine big garments, no, that's not what I've done, but I'm working on creating a small pattern line for hats, beanies and mittens. So I worked this weekend on setting the page up, so I'm going to show you how they look. And this is things you can actually sew and not knit, which is pretty much the selling point of this. And hopefully I can. So this is the one of the product page, and this is a co-worker of mine who is one of the models. And so basically there are 3 patterns in this collection, and you can either use regular knit fabric, you can recycle a sweater, which I've done here, but you wouldn't believe it, would you? It looks like it's knitted by hand, and there will be sizing both for adults and children, and of course we head size for men as well. This yet again an old sweater that I recycle, and all the patterns will be comes with very clearly step-by-step illustrations. So every step is very clearly illustrated with technical illustrations, and also the patterns that I'm working on is very I'm very being cautious, you know, because sometimes I don't really like bulky hat sewing patterns. So all the patterns that I'm doing here is quite fitted, and as you can see I've also worked a lot, you know, creating that round shape, so you won't have any like bulky how to call it, at the end of the darts, right? So they're very smooth looking because I've worked really hard on the construction of that. And this is the more slouchy look if you don't want the beanie, and you can use this for fleece fabrics, and also of course children's sizes if you want to do that. So there are a lot of different options. Again, you can use recycled sweaters. This is a recycled sweater. And the third pattern is a mitten pattern. So again, you can use recycled sweaters. So this is one I've done, but of course you can use regular fabric like this. And so I'm hoping to launch, because basically this is very, how shall I put it, time sensitive launch, because obviously this is sort of thing, especially living in the northern hemisphere, it's just a few months that there is an interest in this type of pattern. So I had to put like the pedal to the metal to get this done basically, and hopefully I can launch it in the mid of October. And I think this could actually be a great thing if you want to make gifts for holidays, well, because they're all really super quick to make. And you can also, of course, you know, for the mittens for instance, you can add lining like I've done on these ones, so that will make them even warmer. And there are lots of ways to use recycled sweaters. As you can see, this is actually the cuff of a sweater, and I would say that they look quite hand knitted, but they are not, because I'm not one of those people who likes to knit. So and oh, you've got some really nice comments in the chat now. How cool, congratulations, says Myra. Thank you. Libby says, I love your new patterns. Rob says, cute. And my daughter need mids. I'm totally check this out. Yes, thank you so much. There will be, of course, mitten sizes, 4 different sizes, so from child to a large hand. So there are definitely children, men and women will be served. And Liz says, wow, that's fantastic, great, going respect. Thank you so much. And Libby says, great to find wool sweaters in the charity shop that people are mistakenly washing and shrunk. This is great for cutting up and raveling. Yes, because you're really good to felt. You can also use obviously felted fabric, because that's really, really good for these type of projects. So you have a lot of fun with that. And these mittens I've done using regular fabric. So this is not recycled, but it's felted stretch wool. And Libby says, you can find cashmere. Yeah, that's very luxury. Kat says, exciting. Thank you. And Kate says, what is your favorite lining fabric from mittens? I'm a big fan of fleece, actually. I find that really warm, so I use that a lot, but I also like to use wool knit if I can get my hands on it, and also regular cotton rib knit if I don't need that much warmth. But also you can get these heavy pile fleece that is almost like Sherpa, I think it's called. Those are super warm. And Duncan says, looks really, really great, especially for winter. Yes, that's great. Thank you so much, Duncan. Sage is there, and there's some really soft full fur to add to the cuffs and lining for the mittens. And sounds love to buy your pattern. Thank you so much. I'm still working on all the details. I mean, it looks like a small project, but it's been quite cumbersome to get it all together. And there will be PDF patterns, of course. And the good thing about doing this kind of small pattern is that you will not have to print out a bunch of pages, so they will be very easy to tape together, and that will also make this project really quick. I'm going to show you some of the hats now as well. You can see this is the one that I showed, which is a recycle sweater, looks like this. And so I think it's really cool that you can upcycle a lot of pre-loved garments and use in this manner. So this is how that one looks. So I'm really excited to share with you now. I still feel a little bit nervous. I was really nervous to ask my co-workers to be models, because they're actually, both the guy and the woman are actually co-workers of mine, and the cute child here, she is the daughter of a co-worker of mine. So it's definitely I've been very supported by people around me, so that's been really great. And I wanted to make the photos look as professional as possible, even though my resources are quite limited. And like it says, for driving, I need some grip on the midst all the way. Yeah, that's good too. So you definitely need some fabric. This kind of wool with a sort of rough surface, they have a great grip, I find, and you can use. It's a lot of felt wool has that nice grip, I think. So that was my pattern launch. I'm hoping to have it done by mid-October, right? If all things go to plan, and of course I will do a separate video about that once I release it next week, and hopefully I will be able to do a little video also with the patterns. My daughters have agreed again to be models for that video, so I'm really excited about doing that. And let me see here. Kate says about the she has a great suggestions about getting the grip. She says hot glue dots works well for traction. That's really great, because you find some mittens that has that built in, and also the socks, right, you can use. Cecilia says, love your beanies, great idea with the recycled sweaters. Thank you so much, Cecilia. And Libby says, you're a great model too. Thank you. And also Sherry says, I really know the names of really good fabrics, like companies like North Face uses. Have you checked out the Polotech brand? They make really nice fleece fabrics that you can buy by the yard as well. I seem to recall there was some issues with the factory. Maybe someone in North America can fill me in on this, but I bought those in the past. I'm really happy with the quality. They come with a lot of different weights. Anyways, I can definitely see the need for a part 2 of the hemming live stream, so stay tuned for that. And I'm very, very happy that so many people turned out, and we had such a great chat. This hour went by so fast, and as always, the last Sunday of each month there will be another live stream, so stay tuned for that. And all other Sundays there will be a regular sewing videos. So thank you so much for everyone, and it was so fun having the chat with you, and we learned tons, and hopefully we can learn even more in the part 2 of this hemming live stream. And that was all for me, and thank you so much, and bye bye.